last night, and I'm looking forward to our session today. I noticed yesterday in the question and answer time that a couple of questions revealed misunderstandings of the fine-tuning argument. And I hope that today's talk will help to clarify matters somewhat. The ancient Greek philosophers were struck by the order that pervades the cosmos. The stars and the planets in their constant revolution across the night sky were especially awesome to the ancients. Plato's Academy lavished extensive time and thought on the study of astronomy, precisely because Plato believed it was the science that would awaken man to his divine destiny. According to Plato, there are two things that lead men to believe in God: the argument from the existence of the soul, and the argument from the order of the motion of the stars, and of all things under the dominion of the mind which ordered the universe. Plato employed these arguments to refute atheism and concluded that there must be a best soul who is the maker and father of all, the king who ordered the primordial chaos into the rational cosmos that we observe today. Aristotle, too, was filled with wonder at the majestic sweep of the glittering host across the night sky of ancient Greece. Anyone who has personally studied the heavens must lend a sympathetic ear to these men of antiquity, I think, who gazed up at the night sky as yet undimmed by pollution and the glare of city lights, and watched the slow but irresistible turn of the cosmos, replete with its familiar constellations, planets and stars across their view, and wondered, what is the cause of all this? Aristotle concluded that the cause was divine intelligence. In his Metaphysics, Aristotle proceeded to argue that there must be a first uncaused cause, which is God, a living, intelligent, immaterial, eternal, and most good being who is the source of order in the universe. Today, many astronomers and astrophysicists, as a result of recent discoveries, are coming to a similar conclusion. Scientists used to think that whatever the early universe might have been like, given sufficient time and some luck, intelligent life forms like ourselves would eventually evolve somewhere in the cosmos. As a result of discoveries over the last 50 years or so, we now know that that assumption was false. In fact, quite the opposite is true. Astrophysicists have been stunned by the discovery of how complex and delicate a balance of initial conditions must be present in the Big Bang itself if the universe is to permit the existence of intelligent life anywhere at all in the cosmos. This delicate balance of initial conditions has come to be known as the fine-tuning of the universe. We've come to discover that the universe is fine-tuned for the existence of intelligent life with a complexity and delicacy that literally defy human comprehension. There are two kinds of fine-tuning. The first involves the constants of nature, and the second involves certain arbitrary physical quantities. First, the constants of nature. What is a constant? When the laws of nature are expressed as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain symbols which stand for unchanging quantities, like the force of gravity, the electromagnetic force, and the subatomic weak force. These unchanging quantities are called constants. The value of these constants are not determined by the laws of nature. There could be universes governed by the same laws of nature even though these constants had very different values than the values they do. So the actual values of the various constants are not determined by nature's laws. Depending on the values of these constants, universes governed by the same laws of nature will look very different. In addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities which are just put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. Because these quantities are arbitrary, they're also not determined by the laws of nature. An example would be the amount of thermodynamic disorder or entropy in the early universe. It's just given in the Big Bang as an initial condition. And the laws of nature then take over and determine how the universe will develop from there. If the initial quantities had been different, then the laws would predict that very different universes would evolve. Now, what scientists have been surprised to discover is that these constants and quantities must fall into an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values if the universe is to permit the existence of intelligent, interactive life. And this is what is meant by the fine-tuning of the universe. So, the term fine-tuning does not mean design. The expression is a neutral term, which doesn't say anything about how the fine-tuning is best explained. Fine-tuning just means that the range of life-permitting values for those constants and quantities is extremely narrow. If the values of even one of these constants or quantities were to be altered by less than a hair's breadth, the delicate balance required for the existence of life would be upset and the universe would be life-prohibiting instead. So, fine-tuning in this neutral sense is uncontroversial and well-established. Physics abounds with examples of fine-tuning. Before I share a few, let me give you some numbers to give you a feel for the delicacy of the fine-tuning. The number of seconds in the history of the universe is around 10 to the 17th power. That's 1 followed by 17 zeros. The number of subatomic particles in the entire known universe is said to be around 10 to the 80th power. Now, these are simply incomprehensible numbers. With those numbers in mind, consider the following. Both the force of gravity and the atomic weak force are so finely tuned that an alteration in their values by even 1 part out of 10 to the 100th power would have prevented a life-permitting universe. Similarly, a change in the value of the so-called cosmological constant, which drives the acceleration of the universe's expansion, by as little as 1 part out of 10 to the 120th power would have rendered the universe life-prohibiting. Here's a real corker. Roger Penrose of Oxford University has calculated that the odds of the universe's initial low entropy condition existing by chance is on the order of 1 chance out of 10 to the power of 10 to the power of 123, a number which is so inconceivable that to call it astronomical would be a wild understatement. The fine-tuning here is simply beyond comprehension. The examples of fine-tuning are so many and so various that they aren't likely to disappear with the advance of science. Like it or not, fine-tuning is just a fact of life, which is scientifically well established. Now, you might be thinking, but if the constants and quantities had different values, then maybe different forms of life would have evolved. But that underestimates the truly disastrous consequences of a change in the values of these constants and quantities. When scientists talk about a universe as being life permitting, they're not talking about just present forms of life. By life, scientists mean the property of organisms to take in food, extract energy from it, grow, adapt to their environment, and reproduce. Anything that can fulfill those conditions counts as life. And the point is, in order for life, so defined, to exist, whatever form it might take, the constants and quantities of the universe have to be unbelievably fine-tuned. Otherwise, disaster results. In the absence of fine-tuning, not even matter, not even chemistry would exist, much less planets where life might evolve. Now, sometimes people will object, but maybe in a universe governed by different laws of nature, such disastrous consequences might not result. But this objection betrays a misunderstanding of the argument. We're not concerned with universes governed by different laws of nature. We have no idea what universes governed by different laws of nature might be like. Rather, we're concerned solely with universes governed by the same laws of nature, but with different values of the constants and quantities. The philosopher John Leslie gives the following illustration. He asks us to imagine a solitary fly resting on a large blank area of the wall. A single shot is fired, and a bullet strikes the fly. Now, even if the rest of the wall outside the blank area is covered with flies, so that a randomly fired bullet would happen to strike one, nevertheless it remains highly improbable that a single randomly fired bullet would strike the solitary fly within the large blank area. In the same way, we need concern ourselves only with universes governed by the same laws of nature in order to determine how likely it is that one of them should be life-permitting. Because the laws are the same, we can determine what would happen if the constants and quantities were to be altered, and the results turn out to be disastrous. A life-permitting universe is like that solitary fly on the wall. The question we face then is this: what is the best explanation of the cosmic fine-tuning? Many people think that the reason the universe is finely tuned for life is because it was designed to be life-permitting by an intelligent designer. But design is not the only alternative. There's also physical necessity and chance. So the key to inferring design as the best explanation will be eliminating these other two alternatives. Accordingly, we can present a very simple three-step argument. Premise 1, the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. 2, it is not due to physical necessity or chance. 3, therefore, it is due to design. This is a logically valid argument whose conclusion follows necessarily from the two premises. The only question then is whether those premises are more plausibly true than false. So let's have a look at them. The first premise, that the fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design, is unobjectionable because it just lists the three alternatives available in the literature for explaining the fine-tuning. If somebody has a fourth alternative, then he's welcome to add it to the list, and then we'll have to consider it when we come to premise 2. But there doesn't seem to be another alternative to the three discussed here. So, the crucial premise is the second premise, that the fine-tuning is not due to physical necessity or chance. Let's examine each of these alternatives in turn. According to the first alternative, physical necessity, the universe has to be life-permitting. The constants and quantities must have the values they do, so that a life-permitting, or rather a life-prohibiting universe is physically impossible. Now, on the face of it, this alternative seems fantastically implausible. It would require us to say that a life-prohibiting universe is a physical impossibility. But why take such a radical view? The constants, as we've seen, are not determined by the laws of nature. So why couldn't they be different? Moreover, the arbitrary quantities are just boundary conditions on which the laws of nature operate. Nothing seems to make them necessary. So the opponent of design is taking a radical line here that requires some sort of proof. But there is none. The alternative is just put forward as a bare possibility. Now, sometimes scientists do talk about a yet-to-be-discovered theory of everything, or a TOE, T-O-E. But like so many of the colorful names given to scientific theories, this label is very misleading. A successful TOE would not enable us to explain literally everything. Its goal is simply to unify the four physical forces of nature: gravity, the weak force, the strong force, and electromagnetism, into a single force carried by a single kind of particle. But it wouldn't even attempt to explain literally everything. For example, the most promising candidate for a TOE to date is so-called M theory, or superstring theory. But that theory only works if there are 11 dimensions. But the theory itself cannot explain why precisely that particular number of dimensions should exist. Moreover, M theory doesn't predict uniquely a life-permitting universe. It permits a vast range of around 10 to the 500th power different possible universes, all consistent with the same laws, but varying in the values of the constants of nature. Almost all of these possible universes are life-prohibiting. This so-called cosmic landscape of worlds permitted by M theory has itself become something of a phenom lately. But it's important to understand that the landscape is just a list of possibilities. Some people have misinterpreted it to mean that all of these different universes actually exist. Some have thought that it undermines the argument for design because the landscape must include life-permitting worlds like ours. But the cosmic landscape is not real. It's just a list of possibilities. It describes the range of universes which are consistent with M theory. And that range is so huge, 10 to the 500th power different possibilities, that some explanation is needed for why a life-permitting universe exists, since life-permitting universes are a practically infinitesimal part of the landscape. So you can't say that life-permitting universes are physically necessary, because on M theory at least, that's clearly false. So there is no evidence that a life-permitting universe is physically necessary. Quite the contrary. All the evidence indicates that life-prohibiting universes are not only possible, but far, far more likely than any life-permitting universe. That leads to the second alternative. Could the fine-tuning be due simply to chance? According to this alternative, it's just an accident that all of the constants and quantities fell into the life-permitting range. We basically just lucked out. The fundamental problem here is that the chances of a life-permitting universe's existing are so remote that this alternative becomes unreasonable. Now, sometimes people will object that it's meaningless to speak of the probability of a finely tuned universes existing, because there is, after all, only one universe. So you can't say, for example, that 1 out of every 10 universes is life-permitting. But the following illustration from the physicist John Barrow clarifies the sense in which a life-permitting universe is improbable. Barrow invites us to take a sheet of paper and place upon it a red dot. That dot represents our universe. Now, alter slightly one or more of the fundamental finely tuned constants or physical quantities that we've been discussing. As a result, you have a description of another universe, which we can represent as a new dot on our sheet in the neighborhood of the first. If that new set of constants and quantities represents a life-permitting universe, then make it a red dot. If it describes a universe that is life-prohibiting, make it a blue dot. Now do it again, and again, and again, and again, until your sheet of paper is filled with dots. And what you will wind up with is a sea of blue with only a few pinpricks of red. And it is that sense in which it is overwhelmingly improbable that the universe should be life-permitting. There are simply vastly more life-prohibiting universes in our local area of possible universes than there are life-permitting universes. Now, sometimes people will try to justify the alternative of chance by appealing to the example of a lottery. In a lottery where all the tickets are sold, it's fantastically improbable that any one person should win. Yet, somebody has to win. It would be unjustified for the winner, whoever he might be, to say, the odds against my winning were 20 million to 1, and yet I won. The lottery must have been rigged. In the same way, they say, some universe out of the range of possible universes has to exist. The winner of the universe lottery would also be unjustified to think that because his universe exists, this must have been the result of design, not chance. All the universes are equally improbable, but one of them, by chance, has to win. Now, this analogy is actually very helpful because it enables us to see clearly where the objector has misunderstood the argument for design, and then to offer a better, more accurate analogy in its place. Contrary to popular impression, the argument for design is not trying to explain why this particular universe exists. Rather, it's trying to explain why a life-permitting universe exists. The lottery analogy was misconceived because it focused on why a particular person won. The correct analogy would be a lottery in which billions and billions and billions of white ping pong balls were mixed together with just one orange ping pong ball. And you're told that one ball will be randomly selected out of the horde. If it's orange, you'll be allowed to live. If it's white, you'll be shot. Now, notice that any particular ball which is randomly selected is equally improbable. No matter which ball rolls down the chute, the odds against that particular ball are fantastically improbable. But some ball must roll down the chute. This is the point that was illustrated by the first lottery analogy. That point is, however, irrelevant because we're not trying to explain why this particular ball was picked. The relevant point is that whichever ball rolls down the chute, it is overwhelmingly more probable that it will be white rather than orange. Getting the orange ball is no more improbable than getting any particular white ball. But it is incomprehensibly more probable that you will get a white ball instead of an orange one. So if the orange ball rolls down the chute, you certainly should conclude that the lottery was rigged to let you live. Now, if you still don't see the point of this analogy, then imagine that in order to be allowed to live, the orange ball had to be randomly selected 5 times in a row. If the odds against the orange balls being selected are great enough, then happening 5 times in a row rather than once will really affect the probability significantly. But if such a thing actually happened, everyone would recognize that it didn't happen by chance. So, in the correct analogy, we're not interested why you got the particular ball you did. Rather, we're puzzled by why, against overwhelming odds, you got a life-permitting ball instead of a life-prohibiting ball. And that question is just not addressed by saying, well, some ball had to be picked. In the same way, some universe has to exist. But whichever universe exists, it is incomprehensibly more probable that it will be life-prohibiting rather than life-permitting. So we still need some explanation for why a life-permitting universe exists. Now, some people have argued that no explanation is needed for why we observe a life-permitting universe, because that's the only kind of universe we could observe. If the universe were not life-permitting, then we wouldn't be here to ask about it. This is the so-called anthropic principle, which says that we can observe only properties of the universe which are compatible with our existence. This reasoning, however, is fallacious. The fact that we can only observe life-permitting universes does nothing to eliminate the need of an explanation for why a life-permitting universe exists. And again, an illustration can help. Think of the person who is dragged in front of a firing squad of 100 trained marksmen, all with rifles aimed at his heart, to be executed. And suppose it turns out that all of the 100 trained marksmen missed. Now, it would be true that that person should not be surprised that he doesn't observe that he's dead. Because if he were dead, then he obviously wouldn't be able to observe it. But he should still be surprised that he does observe that he is alive, given the enormous improbability of the marksmen's all missing. In fact, he'd probably conclude that they all missed on purpose, that the whole thing was engineered for a reason by some person. Theorists have therefore come to recognize that the anthropic principle cannot eliminate the need of an explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe unless it is conjoined with a many worlds hypothesis. According to that hypothesis, our universe is just one member of a world ensemble or multiverse of randomly ordered universes, preferably infinite in number. If all of these other universes really exist, then by chance alone, life-permitting worlds will appear somewhere in the world ensemble. Since only finely tuned universes have observers in them, any observers existing in the world ensemble will naturally look out and observe their worlds to be finely tuned. So no appeal to design is necessary in order to explain fine-tuning. It's pure chance. Now, I think it's worth pausing here for a moment to reflect on what is going on here. The current debate over fine-tuning has now become a debate over the many worlds hypothesis. This hypothesis today is at the heart of the discussion. In order to explain fine-tuning, we are being asked to believe not merely that there are other unobservable universes, but that there is an infinite number of such worlds, and moreover that they are randomly ordered in their constants and quantities. All of this is needed in order to guarantee that a life-permitting universe like ours will appear by chance somewhere in the ensemble. Now this is really quite extraordinary. It's a sort of backhanded compliment to the design hypothesis. For otherwise sober scientists would not be flocking to adopt so speculative and extravagant a view as the world ensemble hypothesis unless they felt absolutely compelled to do so. The fact that theorists are turning to the many worlds hypothesis to rescue the alternative of chance is perhaps the best evidence that the hypothesis of chance is in real trouble. The odds against the existence of a life-permitting universe are just too great to be faced unless you embrace the hypothesis of a world ensemble. Now, one way to respond to the many worlds hypothesis would be to show that the multiverse itself also involves fine-tuning. In order to be scientifically credible, some plausible mechanism must be suggested for generating the many worlds. But if the many worlds hypothesis is to be successful in attributing the fine-tuning to chance alone, then the mechanism that generates the many worlds had better not be finely tuned itself, for then the problem just gets kicked upstairs and the debate arises all over again. But the proposed mechanisms for generating a world ensemble are so vague that it's far from evident that the physics governing the multiverse will be free of any fine-tuning. For example, inflationary cosmology, which is appealed to in order to actualize all of the possibilities in the cosmic landscape, may well involve fine-tuning. So the postulate of a world ensemble is by itself not enough to justify the alternative of chance. Moreover, many theorists are skeptical of the many worlds hypothesis itself. Why think that a world ensemble actually exists? There's no evidence or reason to think that there is such a thing, much less that the number of worlds is infinite in number and randomly ordered. There's no evidence that the sort of world ensemble required by the many worlds hypothesis actually exists. And in fact, many theorists would claim that it's in principle impossible to have this sort of evidence. Thirdly, and I think most fundamentally, the many worlds hypothesis faces what appears to be a devastating objection. Namely, if we were just a random member of a world ensemble, then we ought to be observing a very different universe. Roger Penrose has calculated that the odds of our solar systems forming instantaneously through the random collision of particles is incomprehensibly more probable than the universe is being finely tuned. So, if we were just a random member of a world ensemble, we should be observing a patch of order no larger than our solar system. We should be seeing a patch of order in a sea of chaos surrounding us. Worlds like that are simply incomprehensibly more plentiful in the world ensemble than worlds like ours, and so ought to be observed by us if we are just a random member of such an ensemble. Indeed, in order to be observable, the patch of order doesn't need to be even as large as the solar system. The most probable observable world would be one in which a single brain would fluctuate into existence out of the quantum vacuum and observe its otherwise empty world. So if we were just a random member of a world ensemble, it is overwhelmingly more probable that we ought to be observing a world like that. In other words, the observer self-selection effect is explanatorily vacuous. It does not explain why only finely tuned worlds are observable. As Robin Collins has pointed out, what needs to be explained is not simply life, but embodied, interactive, intelligent agents like ourselves. An appeal to an observer self-selection effect accomplishes nothing because there's no reason to think that most observable worlds are worlds in which that kind of observer exists. In fact, the opposite is true. Most observable worlds will be worlds in which a single brain exists as a result of a quantum fluctuation. It's amazing that so metaphysical a speculation as the world ensemble hypothesis should be susceptible to refutation. One might think that there would just be a standoff between such a hypothesis and the hypothesis of design. But Penrose's argument seems to show otherwise. The world ensemble hypothesis fails as an explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe for interactive agents like ourselves. And with the failure of the many worlds hypothesis, the last ring of defense for the alternative of chance collapses. Neither physical necessity nor chance provides a good explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe. So, what about design? Is this explanation better than physical necessity or chance, or is it equally implausible? Detractors of design will sometimes object that on this hypothesis, the cosmic designer himself remains unexplained. This objection is what Richard Dawkins calls the central argument of my book, The God Delusion. Dawkins' claim is that one is not justified in inferring design as the best explanation of the complex order of the universe, because then a new problem arises, namely, who designed the designer? This objection is flawed on at least two counts. First, in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. This is an elementary point in the philosophy of science. If archaeologists were digging in the earth and discovered things looking like arrowheads and pottery shards, they would be justified in inferring that these artifacts are not the chance result of sedimentation and metamorphosis, but were the products of some unknown group of people, even if they had no explanation of who these people were or where they came from. Similarly, if astronauts were to find a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that this was the product of intelligent agents, even if they had no idea who these agents were or how they got there. In order to recognize an explanation as the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. In fact, when you think about it, such a requirement would lead to an infinite regress of explanation so that nothing could ever be explained. For before you could accept the explanation, you would need to have an explanation of the explanation. But before you could accept the explanation of the explanation, you need to have an explanation of the explanation of the explanation. But before you could accept the explanation of the explanation of the explanation, you need an explanation of the explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on to infinity. Nothing could ever be explained, and science would be destroyed. So, in the case at hand, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of the appearance of design in the universe, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. Whether the designer has an explanation can simply be left an open question for further inquiry. Second, Dawkins thinks that in the case of a divine designer, the designer is just as complex as the thing to be explained, so that no explanatory advance is made. Now, this objection raises all sorts of interesting questions about the role played by simplicity in assessing competing explanations. For example, there are many factors other than simplicity that scientists weigh in determining which explanation is the best, such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, and so forth. An explanation which has broader explanatory scope may be less simple than a rival explanation, but may still be preferred because it explains more things. Simplicity is not the only or even the most important criterion for assessing theories. But leave all of those interesting questions aside. Dawkins' more fundamental mistake lies in his assumption that a divine designer is just as complex as the universe. That is plainly false. As a pure mind without a body, God is a remarkably simple entity. A mind is not a physical object composed of parts. In contrast to the contingent and variegated universe with all its inexplicable constants and quantities, a divine mind is startlingly simple. Now, certainly, such a mind may have complex ideas. It might be thinking, for example, of the infinitesimal calculus. But the mind itself is a remarkably simple spiritual entity. Dawkins has evidently confused a mind's ideas, which may indeed be complex, with a mind itself, which is an incredibly simple entity. Therefore, postulating a divine mind behind the universe definitely does represent an advance in simplicity, whatever that might be worth. Therefore, it seems to me that of the alternatives before us, physical necessity, chance, or design, the most plausible of these three is design. And thus we have a good argument in favor of a cosmic designer of the universe.